Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 31 of our reading of George Orwell's 1984. We have finished the book, but we will be reading the afterword and the appendix about Newspeak, which is really, really fascinating. Anyways, we are going to get that underway presently. First of all, though, of course, we always go over the copyright information. Right here, it says 1961. All rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or portions thereof in any form. So, that's what I'm doing. Anyways, let's get this underway. We were talking about political words in the Newspeak dictionary. So let's continue. In Newspeak, euphony outweighed every consideration other than exactitude of meaning. Regularity of grammar was always sacrificed to it when it seemed necessary, and rightly so, since what was required above all for political purposes was short-clipped words of unmistakable meaning, which could be uttered rapidly and, when roused, the minimum of echoes in the speaker's mind. The words of the B vocabulary even gained in force for the fact that nearly all of them were very much alike. Almost invariably, these words, good think, mini packs, prole feed, sex crime, joy camp, were ingsoc, belly feel, think pole, and countless others. Wait a minute. Sorry about that, I had to blow my nose. Anyways, as I was saying, and countless others were words of 2 or 3 syllables, with the stress distributed equally between the first syllable and the last. The use of them encouraged a gabbled style of speech, at once staccato and monotonous, and this was exactly what was aimed at. The intention was to make speech, and especially speech on any subject not ideologically neutral, as nearly as possible independent and of consciousness. For the purpose of everyday life, it was no doubt necessary to sometimes to reflect before speaking, but a party member called upon to make a political or ethical judgment should be able to spray forth the correct opinions as automatic as machine guns spray forth bullets. His training fitted him to do this. The language gave him an almost foolproof instrument, and the texture of the words with their harsh sounds, and a certain willful ugliness which was in accord with the spirit of ingsoc, assisted the process still further. So did the fact that having very few words to choose from relative to our own, the Newspeak vocabulary was tiny, and new ways of reducing it were constantly being devised. Newspeak, indeed, differed from almost all other languages in that its vocabulary grew smaller instead of larger every year. Each reduction was a gain, since the smaller the area of choice, the smaller the temptation to take thought. Ultimately, it was hoped to make articulate speech issue from the larynx without involving the higher brain centers at all. The aim was frankly admitted in the Newspeak word duckspeak, meaning to quack like a duck. Like various other words in the B vocabulary, duckspeak was ambivalent in meaning, provided that the opinion which were quacked out were orthodox ones. It implied nothing but praise, and when the Times referred to one of the orators of the party as a double plus good duck speaker, it was paying a warm and valued compliment. The C vocabulary was supplementary to the others and consisted entirely of scientific and technological terms. These resembled the scientific terms in use today and were constructed from the same root, but the usual care was taken to define them rigidly and strip them of undesirable meanings. They followed the same grammatical rules of the words in the other two vocabularies. Very few of the C words had any currency either in everyday speech or in political speech. Any scientific workers or technician could find all the words he needed in the list devoted to his own specialty. But he seldom had more than a smattering of the words occurring in the other lists. Only a very few words were common to all lists, and there were no vocabulary expressing the function of science as a habit of mind or a method of thought, irrespective of its particular branches. There was indeed no word for science, any meaning that it could possibly bear being already sufficiently covered by the word ingsoc. From the foregoing account, it will be seen that in Newspeak the expression of unorthodox opinions were above a very low level and well nigh impossible. It was, of course, possible to utter heresies of a very crude kind, a species of blasphemy. It would have been possible, for example, to say Big Brother is ungood, but this statement, which to an orthodox ear merely conveyed a self-evident absurdity, could not have been sustained by reasoned argument, because the necessary words were not available. Ideas inimical to ingsoc could only be entertained in a vague, wordless form, and could not be named in very broad terms, which lumped together and condemned whole groups of heresies without defining them. In doing so, one could in fact only use Newspeak for unorthodox purposes by illegitimately translating some of the words back into Old Speak. For example, all mans are equal, but a possible Newspeak sentence was a possible Newspeak sentence, but only in the same sense in which all men are red-haired is a possible Old Speak sentence. It did not contain a grammatical error, but it expressed a palpable untruth, i.e., that all men are of equal size, weight, or strength. The concept of political equality no longer existed, and the secondary meaning had accordingly been purged out of the word equal. In 1984, when Old Speak was still the normal means of communication, the danger theoretically existed that in using Newspeak words, one might remember their original meaning. In practice, it was not difficult for any purpose well grounded in doublethink to avoid doing this, but within a couple of generations, even the possibility of such a lapse would have vanished. A person growing up with Newspeak as his sole language would no more know that equal had once had the secondary meaning of politically equal, or that free once meant intellectually free, than, for instance, a person who had never heard of chess would be aware of the secondary meaning attached to queen and rook. There would be many crimes and errors which it would be beyond his power to commit, simply because they were nameless and therefore unimaginable. And it was to be foreseen that with the passage of time, the distinguishing characteristics of Newspeak would become more and more pronounced, its words growing fewer and fewer, their meanings more and more rigid, and the chance of putting them to improper use always diminished. Okay. When Old Speak had been once and for all superseded, the last link with the past would have been severed. History had already been rewritten by fragments of the literature of the past surviving. But fragments of the literature of the past survived here and there, imperfectly censored, and so long as one retained one's knowledge of old speak, it was possible to read them. In the future, such fragments, even if they chanced to survive, would be unintelligible and untranslatable. It was impossible to translate any passage of old speak into new speak unless it either referred to some technical purpose or some very simple everyday action. Let me see. 55, 56. Okay. It was already unorthodox. Good thinkful would be the newspeak expression. In tendency. In practice, this meant that no book written before approximately 1960 could be translated as a whole. Pre-revolutionary literature could only be subjected to ideological translation. That is, alliteration in sense as well as language. Take, for example, the well-known passage from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, government are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed, and whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter and abolish it, and to institute new government. It would have been impossible to render this into newspeak while keeping to the sense of the original. The nearest one could come to doing it would be to swallow the whole passage up in the single word crime think. A full translation could only be an ideological translation, whereas Jefferson's words would be changed into a panegyric on absolute government. A good deal of the literature of the past was, indeed, already being transformed in this way. Considerations for prestige made it desirable to preserve the memory of certain historical figures, while at the same time bringing their achievements into line with the philosophies of Ingsoc. Various writers such as Shakespeare, Milton, Swift, Byron, Dickens, and some others were therefore in the process of translation. When the task had been completed, the original writings, with all else that survived of the literature of the past, would be destroyed. These translations were a slow and difficult business, and it was not expected that they would be finished before the first or second decade of the 21st century. There were also large quantities of merely utilitarian literature, indispensable technical manuals, and the like, that had to be treated in the same way. It was chiefly in order to allow time for the preliminary work of translation, and that the final adaptation of newspeak had been fixed for so late a date as 2050. And now let's read the afterword. This is by I forget who it's by. It's by I'll find out. Glenn somebody. I just lost the page. Oh well. Afterward by Eric Fromm. I think he's German. I don't know. Eric is spelled kind of weird. Okay, here we are. George Orwell's 1984 is the expression of a mood, and it is a warning. The mood is expressed is that of near despair about the future of man, and the warning is that unless the course of history changes, men all over the world will lose their most human qualities, will become soulless automatons, and will not even be aware of it. The mood of hopelessness about the future of man is in marked contrast to one of the most fundamental features of Western thought, the faith in human progress and in man's capacity to create a world of justice and peace. This hope has its roots both in Greek and in Roman thinking, as well as in the messianic concept of the Old Testament prophets. The Old Testament prophecy philosophy of history assumes that man grows and unfolds in history and eventually becomes what he potentially is. It assumes that he develops his powers of reason and love fully, and thus is enabled to grasp the world, being one with his fellow man and nature at the same time, preserving his individuality and his integrity. Universal peace and justice are the goals of man, and the prophets have faith that in spite of all errors and sins, eventually the end of days will arrive, symbolized by the figure of the Messiah. The prophetic concept was a historical one, a state of perfection to be realized by man within historical time. Christianity transformed this concept into a transhistorical, purely spiritual one, yet it did not give up the idea of the connection between moral norms and politics. The Christian thinkers of the late Middle Ages emphasized that although the kingdom of God was not within historical time, the social order must correspond to and realize the spiritual principles of Christianity. The Christian sects before and after the Reformation emphasized these demands in more urgent, more active, and revolutionary ways. With the breakup of the medieval world, man's sense of strength and his hope, not only for individual but for social perfection, assumed new strength and took new ways. One of the most important ones is a new form of writing, which developed since the Renaissance, the first expression of which was Thomas More's Utopia, literally, nowhere, a name which was generically applied to all other similar works. Thomas More's Utopia combined a more penetrating criticism of his own society, its irrationality, and its injustice, with the picture of a society which, though perhaps not perfect, had solved most of the human problems, which sounded insoluble to his own contemporaries. What characteristics Thomas More's Utopia and all the others, in that they do not speak in general terms of principles, but an imaginative picture of the concrete details of a society which corresponds to the deepest longings of man. In contrast to prophetic thought, these perfect societies are not at the end of days, but exist already, though in a geographic distance rather than in the distance of time. Thomas More's Utopia was followed by two others, the Italian friar Campanella's City of the Sun and the German humanist Andreas Christianopoulos, the latter being the most modern of the three. There are differences in viewpoints and the originality of the trilogy of utopias, yet the differences are minor in comparison with what they have in common. Utopias were written from then on for several hundred years until the beginning of the 20th century. The latest and most influential utopia was Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, published in 1888. Aside from Uncle Tom's Cabin and Ben-Hur, it was undoubtedly the most popular book at the turn of the century. Printed in many millions of copies in the United States, translated into over 20 languages, Bellamy's Utopia is part of the great American tradition, as expressed in the thinking of Whitman, Thoreau, and Emerson. It is the American version of the ideas which, at that time, found their most forceful expression in the socialist movement in Europe. This hope for man's individual and social perfectibility, which in philosophical and anthropological terms was clearly expressed in the writing of the Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. and of the socialist thinkers of the 19th, remaining unchanged until after the First World War. This war, in which millions died for the territorial ambitions of the European powers, although under the illusion of fighting for peace and democracy, was the beginning of that development, which tended in a relatively short time to destroy a 2,000-year-old Western tradition of hope and to transform it into a mood of despair. Now let's read the little footnote here. The latest edition was published by the New American Library of World Literature, Incorporated, New York, 1960, CD 26. Okay, here we are. The moral callousness of the First World War was only the beginning. Other events followed. The betrayal of the socialist hopes by Stalin's reactionary state capitalism, and several economic crises at the end of the 20s. The victory of barbarism in one of the oldest centers of culture in the world, Germany, the insanity of Stalinist terror during the 30s, the Second World War, in which all the fighting nations lost some of their moral considerations, which had still existed in the First World War, and an unlimited destruction of civilian populations, started by Hitler, and continued by the even more complete destruction of cities such as Hamburg and Dresden and Tokyo, and eventually by the use of atomic bombs against Japan. Since then, the human race has been confronted with an even greater danger, that of the destruction of our civilization, if not of all mankind, by thermonuclear weapons, as they exist today and as they are being developed in increasingly frightful proportions. Most people, however, are not consciously aware of this threat and of their own hopelessness. Some believe that just because modern warfare is so destructive, war is impossible. Others declare that even if 60 or 70 million Americans were killed in the first 1 or 2 days of a nuclear war, there is no reason to believe that life would not go on as before after the first shock had been overcome. It is precisely and the significance of Orwell's book that it expresses the new mood of hopelessness which pervades our age. Before this mood had become manifest and taken hold of the consciousness of people. Orwell is not alone in this endeavor. Two other writers, the Russian Zamyatin in his book We, and Aldous Huxley in The Brave New World, have expressed the mood of the present and a warning for the future in ways very similar to Orwell's. This new trilogy of what might be called the Negative Utopias of the middle of the 20th century is the counterpoint to the trilogy of Positive Utopias mentioned before, written in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Negative Utopias express the mood of powerlessness and hopelessness in modern man, just as the early utopias expressed the mood of self-confidence and hope of post-medieval man. There could be nothing more paradoxical in historical terms than this change. It should be added that Jack London's The Iron Heel, the prediction of fascism in America, is the earliest of the modern negative utopias. Okay. Man, at the beginning of the industrial age, when in reality he did not possess the means for a world in which the table was set for all who wanted to eat. When he lived in a world in which there was economic reasons for slavery, war, and exploitation, in which man only sensed the possibility of his new science and of its appreciation to technique and to production. Nevertheless, man at the beginning of modern development was full of hope. 400 years later, when all these hopes and all these hopes are realizable when man can produce enough for everybody, when war has become unnecessary because technical progress can give any country more wealth than can territorial conquest, when this globe is in the process of becoming as unified as a continent was 400 years ago, at the very moment when man is on the verge of realizing his hope, he begins to lose it. It is the essential point of all the three negative utopias, not only to describe the future towards which we are moving, but also to explain the historical paradox. The three negative utopias differ from each other in detail and emphasis. Zamyatin's We, written in the 20s, has more features in common with 1984 than with Huxley's Brave New World. We and 1984 both depict the complete bureaucratized society in which man is a number and loses all sense of individuality. This is brought about by a mixture of unlimited terror in Zamyatin's book, A Brain Operation is added eventually, which changes man even physically, combined with ideological and psychological manipulation. In Huxley's work, the main tool for turning man into an automaton is the application of hypnoid mass suggestion, which allows dispensing with terror. One can say that Zamyatin's and Orwell's examples resemble more the Stalinist and Nazi dictatorships, while Huxley's Brave New World is a picture of the development of the Western industrial world, provided it continues to follow the present trend without fundamental change. We are going to continue this. We made it we only have about 6 pages left. We've been reading George Orwell's 1984. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information is in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.